I'm Pat Zerke, the director of Cambridge Forum, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to this program as we host Michael Dimock, the president of the Pew Research Center, in conversation with Ted Landsmark, the president emeritus of Boston Architectural College. They'll be discussing the question, can a polarized people maintain a healthy democracy? Our forum tonight will be led by Ted Landsmark. He is president emeritus of the Boston Architectural College and was previously the dean of graduate and continuing education at the Massachusetts College of Art.
One of the defining features of early 21st century American politics is the political polarization of our citizenry, as well as of their elected representatives. This is reflected not only in the public's views about issues ranging from immigration to guns, but also in their personal lives and lifestyles. In June 2014, the Pew Research Center documented how the American people have become ideologically polarized over the past 20 years. Michael Dimock discusses this groundbreaking study looking at the causes of this growing divide and its implications for the health of our democracy. The question is, can a polarized public maintain a healthy democracy? Michael Dimock is the president of the Pew Research Center. He's a survey researcher and political scientist by training. He oversees the center's overall operations and research agenda, including research on politics, religion, demographics, media, technology, and international issues, and also on the interactions among those subjects. So let's welcome to the Cambridge Forum, Michael Dimock. Michael?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ted, for that nice introduction, and thank you all for having me and coming out on what could be a rainy night, but we'll knock on wood that it stays nice. As Ted said, I'm at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. We're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy research organization whose mission is to try to bring facts to the table to help inform the public, inform debate, lift debates, bring information in where otherwise we're operating on anecdote or observation or presupposition. And we cover a wide range of issues at the Pew Research Center, both domestic, foreign, religion, media. I've been focusing mainly on politics, and I've come tonight to talk about this study that Ted introduced on political polarization in the American electorate. We were inspired to do this study because there's a great deal of information available about what's going on in Congress. There are many political science scholars who study congressional voting patterns and how members of Congress operate. And there's just definitive evidence that the American Congress has become more polarized into partisan camps. In the last election cycle, looking at the voting records of members, there wasn't a single Republican who was to the left, arguably, of any Democrat. The two curves of the parties had pulled apart completely. As recently as 2000, not to mention the 90s, 80s, 70s, and 60s, there was a lot of overlap between the political parties in an ideological sense in Congress. There were many conservative Democrats, more liberal Republicans. There were opportunities for compromise between those overlapping members. And you saw the tools of politics used in different ways, whether it's the filibuster or other functions that have become more prevalent, at least as threats in Congress. But given so much data on what's happening in Congress, we felt there was actually a dearth of understanding about what is the nature of polarization in the American public. I mean, at one end of the spectrum, it could be that the public isn't polarized, that what we're seeing in Congress is a misrepresentation of of the American electorate, and that it has to do with the institutions of politics that are driving that, or the electoral process, or other factors. At the other end of the spectrum, it could be Congress is just a mirror of the American electorate, that in fact they're just receiving signals from their voters about how they want them to behave, and they're behaving accordingly. And within that range, there's probably a middle ground that we wanted to understand and bring some data and context to. So we set apart to do this study last year with, we compiled support from the Pew Charitable Trust, from the Hewlett Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, some individual donors, to do, as Ted said, the largest political study we had ever done to try to really understand the full dimensions of this issue. Let me start by saying that political polarization sounds simple, but it's not. It has different dimensions and elements to it in terms of how to think about what it means for people to be separated or polarized in a political sense. And one of the most important aspects of thinking about polarization is a phenomenon that we refer to as growing ideological consistency. Some people refer to it as sorting. And what it really means is not necessarily the extremity of your views, how passionate or how maybe out in the wings you are on any given issue, be it guns or abortion or government or healthcare or whatever, but how much your issue positions or your values align across multiple dimensions. Do you take a more liberal perspective of the role of government and of social issues like homosexual rights? Do you take a conservative position on regulation as well as on foreign policy issues? How much are your issue views as the way that you look at government and society aligning consistently across multiple dimensions in a consistently liberal or conservative way? And that is one of the most powerful trends that we've seen in the American electorate over the last 20 years. We asked people a series of 10 questions that we've been asking over the course of this period regularly so that we could track the change over time. And let me give you a little taste of some of the questions to give you some context of it. We would ask people to choose which statement comes closer to their view, even if neither is exactly right, which one sort of resonates with you. So one pair of statements might be, government regulation of business usually does more harm than good, or government regulation of business is necessary to protect the public interest. Immigrants today are a burden on our country because they take our jobs, housing, and health care, or immigrants today strengthen our country because of their hard work and talents. Another might be, good diplomacy is the best way to ensure peace, or the best way to ensure peace is through military strength. Poor people today have it easy because they can get government benefits without doing anything in return. Or poor people have hard lives because government benefits don't go far enough to help them live decently. Or homosexuality should be discouraged by society, or homosexuality should be accepted by society. There are a whole series of questions formulated that way, and the objective is to understand how many people sort of straight line those issues in a more liberal or conservative way. And what we found was that in 1994, when we asked those questions, only 10% of Americans were consistently liberal or consistently conservative. So you can imagine, if you're a statistician, there's kind of a bell curve shape of answers of how many you answered in a liberal or a conservative way. And in the end, in the 1990s and 2000s, the tails of those curves, the share of people who really have consistently liberal or conservative views was very small, 10%. By the study we did last year, it had more than doubled to 21% of the American public who consistently, across all 10 of these questions, answered at 10 out of 10 or at least 9 out of 10 in a liberal or a conservative way. So that's a kind of alignment of political thinking that characterizes the era that we're in right now. Important to remember, that's still a minority, right? Only 21% of the public. The center of that curve, people who answered 5 in a liberal or 5 in a conservative, or 6 and 4 one way or the other, that's how we define people who were mixed in their thinking. That was 49% of the public when we asked these questions in 1994. It's fallen to 39% of the public today. Still, a lot of people. It's not like the whole nation has completely separated into camps. So the first piece of evidence here is what's happened in Congress with a complete separation of the two political parties is not a mirror image of the American public. The reality is that in the American public, there are a lot of people who are not dogmatically down the line liberal and conservative in their thinking. There are many people who are in the center, but the trend is toward these more ideologically framed thinking, and as I'll talk about in a second, these are the folks who are the most active and participatory in the American system on both the left and the right. This is also aligned more with political party identification than in the past. As I said before, there used to be many liberal conservatives liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. Today, that is less and less and less the case. The share of Democrats who are consistently liberal and the share of Republicans who are consistently conservative has continued to grow. So the nature of the two political parties has become much more distinct than it was 20 or 10 years ago. There's a second element to partisanship, though, to polarization, though, that's important to think about. That, what I was just describing, is really ideology, how you look at the world, what your priorities are for government, how you see societal change. Another element of partisanship that we found to be very powerful is what we refer to as partisan antipathy, or what some scholars talk about as negative polarization. And what this is a bit more of an emotional sense of partisan identity, and in particular, the perception of the other political party, how Democrats view Republicans and how Republicans view Democrats. And in here, we're seeing a very stark shift towards a more kind of antagonistic view of political divisions in American politics. There's a classic polling question that we use to just get a basic grasp on this, which is, all in all, would you say you have a very favorable, mostly unfavorable, or very unfavorable view of the Democratic Party? How about of the Republican Party? How about, and we might name a whole number of other institutions and organizations. And what we find is that the share of Democrats who hold a very unfavorable view of Republicans has soared. It's gone from 17% in 1994. And 1994 was not a period without political conflict, right? 17% then to 43% now. On the right, from 16% to 38%. Seeing the other side, not just unfavorably, people have always sort of disliked the other side, but very unfavorably. And so we thought, well, maybe very unfavorably doesn't really mean much. Maybe it's just sort of a word, very. Maybe there's not actually a lot of intensity there. So we said, well, let's ask these folks a follow-up question. If you said you had a very unfavorable view of the Democratic Party, we went ahead and asked you, well, would you go so far as to say that the Democratic Party is so misguided that they pose a threat to the well-being of the nation, or wouldn't you go that far? And the same for the other side. Would you go so far as to say the Republican Party is a threat to the well-being of the nation? And in fact, most of those people who said they had a very unfavorable view would go that far. They really were willing to say that the other side wasn't just a little bit off, wasn't just doing things that you didn't agree with completely, but was a threat to the well-being of the nation, a sense of real distance from the other party. And what you see over time is not partisan polarization isn't people becoming more strongly affiliated with their side, but more threatened by the other side, and that's the general trend. You see that in presidential job approval ratings, one of the oldest running polling questions that's been out there, that the president's partisans are very consistent in how they rate their president, whether it's Republicans rating a Republican president or Democrats rating a Democrat. It's how the other party views the president that's really changed. Over the course of Eisenhower's presidency, 88% of Republicans approved of his job, and 49% of Democrats did as well. A difference, but still not huge, nothing like we see today. When Reagan was president, 83% of Republicans approved, but so did 31% of Democrats, averaged over the course of his presidency. By Clinton, it was 80% and 27%. By Bush, it was 81% and 23%, and now with Obama, it's 81% of Democrats on average approve, and 14% of Republicans. What you're seeing is this steep antipathy from the other party, a sense of threat, a sense of unease with what the other party's leadership is doing to the nation. Now, The third question that we wanted to ask was, how much of this is just about how people look at issues and look at political institutions? Is this actually affecting people in their personal lives? Is this something that matters in the way people interact with people around them and the way that they look and make choices in their daily lives? Again, there are a lot of anecdotes and stories about this, but we wanted to bring some data to the table here. And I think there's a key component of this that matters, which is, are people sort of not only sorting themselves out ideologically, but sorting themselves out in ways where they're only hearing messages that reinforce their sort of predispositions to start with, what some people call ideological silos or echo chambers, where whether it's media choices or even the people you interact with in your daily life are generally people who share your predispositions. And we find that there's a fair amount of evidence of that in a number of ways, in the way people talk about their lives and the way people describe the people who they talk with about politics. We asked people, nope, I have to get my glasses here. Would you say that most of your friends share your political views, have different political views, or don't you really know what their views are? And overall, 35% of Americans nationwide said that most of their friends share their political views. In fact, the most common answer is to say, I'm not really sure what my friends' political views are. But among these folks who are very conservative, consistently conservative and liberal in their perspectives, it's a majority who say that most of their friends that they talk with about politics share their views. The people with those mixed views about politics that I described before, they're sort of some conservative, some liberal, the vast majority of them say they don't know what their friends think about politics. Presumably, and we find from other questions that they don't really talk about politics that much. We also ask people, well, would you say it's important to you to live in a place where most people share your political values? Only a third, less than a third of Americans overall say that's an important factor to them in choosing where to live. But again, you see this sort of U-shaped curve where the folks who are the most ideologically oriented in their thinking are significantly more likely to say that choosing to live in a community where people share their values is something that matters to them. And you see it in these kind of stereotypes that people talk about. Conservatives want to live in McMansions out in the exurbs, and liberals like to live in urban enclaves where there's lots of activity. Well, there's some truth to that in the way people describe their preferences over communities and neighborhoods. We ask people, well, if you could choose, would you prefer to live in an area where houses are larger and farther apart, but schools, stores, and restaurants are several miles away? Or would you prefer to live in a place where the houses are smaller and closer to each other, but schools and stores and restaurants are within walking distance? The American public at large is almost exactly 50-50. If they could make that choice, it was almost 49% one way, 48% the other way. But when you look at it through that ideological lens, it's almost a complete inversion. By 75 to 22, the folks who were consistently conservative in their views said they preferred the larger houses farther out, and by 77% to 21%, the consistent liberals said they preferred the smaller places if they could be closer in walking distance to all these activities that they valued. You see it in the desire to live in diverse places. Racial and ethnic diversity is a high priority for these liberals, but living in an area where people share your religious faiths is of a high importance to people who are at the more conservative end of the spectrum. So there's reason to think that some of the choices we're making in our daily lives, the preferences that we have, could be reinforcing those kind of ideological silos or environments that could be increasingly different for people of different walks. We also asked a question, well, how would you react if an immediate family member of yours were to marry someone who was, and we listed a whole bunch of different kinds of traits, one of which was a Democrat, one of which was a Republican. Very few people, let's not be serious here, very few people say it would bother them if someone in their family married someone of the other party. Only 9% of Democrats say they would be upset if somebody in their family married a Republican, and only 8% of Republicans say this about somebody marrying a Democrat. But again, you see this same sort of increased intensity among these minorities of Americans the minority of Americans who are very ideological in their thinking and see the other party as a threat or as in a very unfavorable way. 3 out of 10, 30% of consistent conservatives say they would be upset if somebody in their family married a Democrat. 23% of people who are consistently liberal say the same about somebody in their family marrying a Republican. So what are the implications of this? I think one of the things that drove our thinking, again, starting with a view of what's happening in Congress, is there seems to be just gridlock is a fundamental characteristic of this era of politics. Party leaders, whether in the White House or in Congress, who seem incapable of finding ways to bridge the gap between their views, and really a lack of desire to do so. A sense, in fact, sometimes that appears that they would almost rather lose for all of us than give the other side any sign of victory, that the battle of politics has become all-consuming. And again, the question we were asking ourselves was, well, when you talk to political leaders about it, they almost invariably say, I am doing what the American people demand. I'm listening to my constituents. I am following what the voters want. And you think, well, are they? Is that really the message that they're hearing from their constituents? Are Americans resistant to compromise? And if you think about that trend toward antipathy that I talked about before, that is a big factor. If people see the other side as a threat to the nation, well, you would think it might affect their willingness to compromise with them. It's not so much the conviction that we're inherently right about everything, but the threat of the other side taking advantage, moving the goalpost, a slippery slope, however people want to think about it, that the very notion of compromising or giving ground to an opponent that you see as so distant from you is a much more threatening thing. To try to get at this, we asked people a question. We said, look, when Obama and Republican leaders differ on important issues, where do you think things should end up? On a scale from 0 to 100, imagine this, where 100 means Obama gets everything he wants and Republicans get nothing. And 0 means Republicans get everything they want and Obama gets nothing. And half the people heard the numbers in the reverse because we wanted to be sure it was fair and all that. About half of Americans, given that scale from 0 to 100, goes straight to 50-50. There's a desire from the bulk of the American public to see compromise as a 50-50 solution between Obama and Republicans on important issues. But, won't surprise you, the folks who are more ideologically oriented in their approach to politics don't see it that way. In fact, 62% of consistent liberals say that the ideal solution when there's a disagreement is that Obama gets most of what he wants. In fact, on average, they said Obama should get about 2/3 of what he wants. Some share of them, like 10% or so, said Obama should get everything he wants. Republicans shouldn't get anything. And the same on the other end of the spectrum. There's a core segment of the population who are consistently conservative who believe that Republicans, when there's a disagreement, it's our side that should get more of what we want in those debates. Now again, everybody in the center is clumping on 50-50, and then you have these two groups on the sides who are saying, no, we can't compromise with the other side on this. We've got to stick to our guns. And we saw that play out in the fall of 2013 when the government shut down. And we asked people, who do you think should give ground in this situation when the government's shut down? Who's going to have to back down? Of course, Republicans said Obama should back down. Democrats said that the GOP leaders should back down. So we asked the Republicans, we said, well, look, if the only way to end this shutdown is for Republicans to drop their proposed changes to the health care law, remember that's what they were, kind of holding out for, was a modification to Obamacare. Would it be acceptable or unacceptable for Republican leaders to give on this if it was the only way to end this? And majority of Republicans said unacceptable. And the same on the left. We said if the only way to end this is for Obama to accept some changes to the health care law, would that be acceptable or unacceptable? 58%, unacceptable to give ground. So you see that playing out in some of these debates, that those political leaders are saying, I'm listening to my voters, and you know what they're telling me? Don't give ground, don't back down. Because if you back down, you're giving up. It's just the beginning. They're going to take more, they're going to take more. They see it as a more threatening element. Now let me sort of wrap that up by saying, well, so why is it that the tails of this ideological distribution have so much sway in the American political system? All throughout, all the data we see shows that most Americans don't see the other parties as a threat to the country. Most Americans don't think in sort of down the line liberal or conservative perspectives about politics. Yet those seem to be the driving forces in the system. And it's because you see this so strongly correlated with political participation and activism in American politics. By every measure of participation in the political process that we asked, you see what I refer to as sort of this U-shaped curve of participation. The people on the wings are higher on every measure in terms of their level of engagement, and the folks who are more mixed in their views about politics, who don't feel strongly about the other political party, are much, much less likely to participate. You see it in voting propensity. The folks on the left and the right much more likely to say they always vote, and the evidence we have from the last cycle where we looked at voting records and matched them up to these folks, they really did turn out at a much, much higher rate in the 2014 midterm, particularly the conservative side in that cycle. One of the most powerful ones is making contributions to political candidates or groups. Overall, only about 15% of Americans say they've made a political contribution to a candidate or a group who's advocate, in an election context, not other kinds of donation and giving. That rises to 28% of people who are consistently liberal and conservative, who make donations to candidates and elections, only 8% of people who are mixed in their political views. So you're looking at a differential there of 3 times, 4 times the level of political giving among folks who are ideological in their thinking than from folks who are less ideological in their thinking. And the same is true when you look at the pattern related to this antipathy dimension. And in fact, those 2 dimensions kind of combine to be even more powerful. If you drill down to the even narrower segment of the public who both thinks in an ideological sense and thinks the other party's a threat, you're off the charts in these levels of participation. These are the folks who are the most active, who are writing letters to candidates, who are reaching out and participating in the political process in more and more ways. And so you're left with a sort of environment where you have arguably a majority of the country who's not, say, caught up in that kind of cycle of partisan thinking. But the actual landscape of the electoral process, particularly when you go to lower turnout engagements like primaries or midterm elections, or where those voices that are more ideological in their thinking are much, much more prevalent, much, much more powerfully heard. And then when you drill down even farther to the campaign environment, who's showing up at campaigns, who's writing letters, who's signing up to follow their members on Twitter and interact with them in that kind of active feedback loop way, you're seeing so much more of that activity coming from these voices on the left and on the right in political politics. And let me just close by saying there's been a big question going on about whether this is asymmetrical. And when a lot of the congressional scholars look at the data about voting patterns in Congress, there's fairly strong evidence that the Republican Party has moved much farther to the right, more so than the Democratic Party has moved to the left over this time span. I'm not a congressional voting scholar, it's not my kind of data, but it's a fairly broad consensus among congressional scholars that that movement has happened. The parties have moved apart, but it's a much starker shift on the right than the left. What we find in this data is that at the public level, this really is happening at both sides. Both Democrats and Republicans have become more ideological in their mindsets. Both have become more sort of negative toward the other political party, if not fearful, if not antagonistic. Right now, those sentiments, particularly those more emotional sentiments, are stronger on the right than on the left. The share of Republicans who see the Democratic Party as a threat is higher than vice versa. The share of Republicans who have deeply, deeply negative views of Obama is the highest we've ever seen. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's as high as how Democrats felt about Bush in 2006. That some of why you see that imbalance right now is what political scientists would call a regime effect, that the party that's out of power or feels like it's out of power tends to feel that emotional charge more intensively. And one of the questions, if I could go back in a time machine and ask in the past, had I known, would be that question about whether the other party's a threat to the well-being of the nation. Because my suspicion is that in the late 2000s, in George W. Bush's second term, there was a lot of passion among Democrats, a lot of perception that the Republican Party was a threat to the well-being of the nation. And you saw that differential in turnout in 2006 that led to one of the biggest Democratic, victory margins in congressional elections that we'd seen. So I think you have some tangential evidence that there can be sort of a seesaw effect in this question about whether one side or the other is really the cause of this polarization. I think the evidence in general suggests that it's really happening on both sides of the aisle, and it may vary a little bit depending on the particular context at any moment. But without further, I'll stop there, and we can have a broader conversation about all of this.
I have to say, it's a very confusing time for America in terms of how our viewpoints as expressed through polling, surveying, and election outcomes actually translate into policy that shows up in all of our states and cities and towns. So on the one hand, we have a state like Wisconsin, which has traditionally been associated with a kind of communitarian, pro-labor sense, going back to the days of La Follette and others. And yet they've elected a governor who's now running for president, who is openly anti-union. And so the question is, how did that happen? We have states across the United States where people have long expressed an antipathy towards same-sex marriage, and yet within the past 5 years, 2/3 of the states in the United States have approved same-sex marriage. We have a state like South Carolina, long associated with racism and conservatism and what have you, and yet there is a woman of East Indian descent who is their governor, and one of their senators is African American. And Massachusetts hasn't had an African American senator in decades. And so it's a point in time where expressions are made concerning values, key values, and yet outcomes don't necessarily always reflect those key values, particularly in venues where you think the values would be most obvious. And so the first question I would have to ask is, ultimately, and it's a question that we all need to address, what difference does it make? We are very much enamored with hearing polling results that speak to narrowly held values that we may have, and yet policy doesn't always seems to translate into the values that particular electorates express. And that's the case here in Massachusetts, a avowedly progressive state in the eyes of most of the nation. And yet we've had a series of Republican governors and senators. So at a certain level, one has to ask, what difference does it make that the electorate seems to be so polarized? And I would hope that we would all get into a question of whether we are so enamored with the story, the narrative, that we lose sight of what the actual outcomes may in fact turn out to be. But we're also going into, are already in a national election cycle. And it is clear that 2 years from now there will be a different person in the White House. There are a great many rather diverse candidates running within the Republican Party, and far fewer running within the Democratic Party. And so it would appear that at least one party already has achieved a certain kind of consensus around a set of values that that particular party would like to see expressed moving forward, while the Republicans are debating among themselves as to whether they should reach out more to a more diverse electorate or focus more on bringing out the more narrowly defined electorate. I think the underlying question that we need to address here is, why does this happen ultimately? Why has it happened? How much of a role is played in terms of that polarization by demographics, new media, technology, the ability to accumulate information much more rapidly than has ever been the case before? I think we have to ask ourselves why it is that in a nation which is arguably per capita the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, with more and more resources, why it is that it seems to be so difficult for us to be able to define for ourselves what our sense of community is. What does it mean to be in a community at this point? What does it really mean to live in a place where folks can, as one would anticipate in a democracy, have differing views, but still be able to come to some kind of consensus? And gridlock, I think everyone agrees, is an awful thing for democracy, and it doesn't reflect where many of us think we ought to be in terms of a policy-making process. But then we also have to ask ourselves, to what extent has the gridlock in fact hurt many of the people who are upset about the nature of gridlock? We know it's an awful thing and it gets reported all the time, but despite gridlock, Obamacare exists and many more Americans have health care that they didn't have 2 or 3 years ago. So for me, the initial set of questions is, how do we translate this sense of polarization, this actual polarization, into real policy? Does it make a difference? And then the second fundamental question I would ask is, what are the things that we do agree on? And to what extent do those things that we do agree on drive the way we go about setting policy? One of the oddest things to occur over the past couple of months is that the political left and the political right seem to be in agreement that income inequality, which is at the greatest level it's been at in many years in this country and increasing, is a bad thing. And both politically conservative individuals and folks like Mayor de Blasio or Mayor Walsh here in Boston both seem to agree that policies need to be made that address this horrible thing that is inevitably a result of a capitalist economy where differences are going to occur within the distribution of finances. Everyone seems to agree that income inequality is a bad thing. The question is, how does that belief then translate into real policy that may change minimum wages or distributions of social services or an increase in the size of the security net? So apart from the questions that we may have about research methodology, who gets asked, how the fact of asking may skew data, I think there is general agreement that the data is, on one level, particularly troublesome in a democracy where we expect divergent views, but where at the same time we hope to be able to achieve some kind of consensus that drives policy forward on important issues. So the first question I would start with is, why does this polarization make a difference?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, again, I go back to the idea that polarization is a phenomenon. I think there are real objective measures that you can see this happening. But at the same time, it's not the predominant worldview in this nation. It's not the lens through which the majority of Americans look at either ideological debates, substantive debates, or the political actors in our system. And so then you sort of say, well, so how then does it affect the policy environment? And I think the examples you raise are good ones. You can see many examples where at local levels, state levels in particular, you are seeing changes in political policy or the election of political leaders who don't seem to fit what you might expect in these situations. Or I think even more destabilizing in some respect is a kind of whipsaw effect in politics, where I think the pattern we've seen in the last few cycles at the national level is one where you'll have a higher turnout presidential election, a lower turnout midterm election, that the actual electorates are changing in such fundamental ways that it's almost as if two different Americas are voting. And then you're seeing the impact of that on the institutions of politics as well. So I think in some respects, the key question to ask is, whose voices are really driving the process at any given point, whether it's a election for a governor in a state or a referendum on a particular policy issue that's playing out in a state or a locality. We can find the general contours of the body politic broadly. But what we're finding in a lot of our polling is that it ebbs and flows, and that people get very activated at certain moments and become much more engaged and much more participatory. And this comes as no surprise. People have known this in campaign politics probably as far back as campaigns have been run. The thing that mobilizes people more than any other is fear. And that's where some of that cycle starts up, is that the best way to get your side to really get engaged is to make them afraid of what the other side's going to do. And that's been the tenor of campaign politics. As I say, I don't want to say this is a new phenomenon. You can find plenty of it all the way back to when this building was built, But I think there's a sophistication to it now. I think you mentioned technology, and we can talk about that more. That's allowed for targeting, that's allowed for messaging, that's allowed for ways to reach people that is new and potentially sort of exacerbates some of that back and forth that creates, I think, an instability in the political process. That would be one general observation I would make about that.
And I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on the role of technology in that regard. Whether we're talking about political change in the Middle East or elsewhere, technology has played a role. Whether we talk about shaping opinions in very targeted ways throughout the United States. There are individuals who've benefited from universal health care who are still opposed to it, or at least they say they are. How does technology and the targeting of specific subgroups impact on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's multifaceted, and it's such a moving target. We have a whole research unit on media and information in a democracy, and things change so fast it's a little hard to kind of stay on top of what's happening, and the tools you use to measure it need to continue to change. But I think I would say three things. One is, as I just said, I think the campaign environments have changed. You saw a fundamental shift in campaign strategy over the same period that we're talking about here, from true mass level communication to much more micro-targeted communication. And that's the name of the game now in politics. Obama, one of the big storylines of the 2008 election was their ability to have the boiler room working and figure out the nature of who they should be touching and when and with what messages. That's become the coin of the realm now in politics. And I think it creates environments where people aren't always being spoken to as a broad electorate, but who are being talked to as part of subunits and focusing in on different issues for different people, which can create a different environment in the way people think about why they're voting, what they're voting for, and the nature of that participation. I think another element, which I hinted at in my presentation, is how people experience politics and talk about it, the level of diversity in people's environments and communities. And that's not just this sort of geographic sorting that some people talk about, that people are literally separating out, either into regions or even into sub-regions, inner cities, outer suburbs. Again, that is, from a demographer's point of view, which I take seriously, the evidence of that is still a little mixed. Not everybody has the opportunity to move. As much as they might say, this is where I'd prefer to live, not all of us get to live where we'd prefer to live. And the reality of that kind of, how much of that kind of self-selection is really driving this is contestable, but I think there are hints of it in places. The kind of technological sorting or these kind of echo chambers that I think are more compelling are in the communities of information that we participate in a digital era, whether it be social media redefining the nature of our interpersonal communities, or whether it be the media environment and the way we select information sources about what's going on in politics or in the world. And what we're finding in our research is a couple of things. One, most Americans actually have tools by which to select who they do and don't talk about, who they do and don't engage with, that are so much more stark than the way it used to be. And it basically comes down to who you friend and who you defriend on Facebook, who you follow and who you stop following in Twitter. And we actually asked people about that. And we said, well, have you ever stopped following somebody on Facebook because you disagreed with their political views? And you see this same sort of pattern. In this case, it was actually people who are on the left who were the most likely to say that that's happened to them. And you can imagine the scenario, you know, their old college, their old high school class, you know, friends, and then they're like, oh, geez, I don't really like listening to that guy. Click. You know, and then boom, you know, the channel can narrow to hearing from the folks who you agree with. I think there's another element of it that I find very interesting and we're interested in studying, which is we often talk about the media, the sort of technological effects downstream, meaning what effect it has on the electorate. But I actually think there's an interesting upstream effect as well in the change in the media environment, which is what is the feedback loop that elected officials are responding to? And you can see, it was hardly a golden era of media, but 20, 30 years ago, you can make the case that most elected officials, whether it be state or a Congress member, they were worried about what was going to run on the front page of the paper the next day. There was a DC bureau that had a person from the Houston Chronicle or, you know, the San Diego Tribune or whatever paper you're talking about that was in Washington, DC, and was asking them questions about the local implications of policies that they were debating, and that was going to report on that in a mass way back in the district. And members worried about that, and they had press people who worried about that. Well, those DC bureaus are almost entirely gone now. Whether that has a big effect or not, it's still something we're actually interested in studying. And the main feedback loop, or arguably a bigger feedback loop, I shouldn't overstep myself here, is this sort of social media interaction. Almost every member of Congress now is active on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all these things. And you know who's following them? They're true believers. You know, the folks who we're describing at the ends of the tails here. And the folks who are liking what they do, the folks who are responding to what they do, are people who are providing that same feedback loop that sort of pulls them farther and farther out. And there are fewer of those, let's say, mass audience mediating media who sort of scare them from saying crazy things, let's just say it, you know. When a member is speaking to an audience, maybe a small audience, are they going to moderate the tone of what they say because they see that bureau guy sitting out there and writing down what they say, or are they going to fan the flames because the folks who are listening are the folks who they want to motivate and accelerate into the political process? And I think the way that technology has changed has that kind of upstream effect on the political process as well.
I want to involve folks who are here in the room with their questions, but I'll pose one more as they are beginning to come forward, and that is, assuming that the polarization does in fact have a number of negative implications in a democracy, what is it that your polling it seems to indicate needs to be done or can be done to counteract that. For those of us who've been heavily involved all of our lives in social action activities, the polarization in and of itself may not be such a bad thing if, in fact, we can persuade folks in the middle to join with us enough to change policy. But if, in fact, that polarization serves to mitigate the likelihood of being able to develop policy one way or another, what is it that one would have to do in order to offset that polarization?
Right. I think one of the biggest challenges that potentially needs to happen, and if I had a solution, I would tell you, I'm not sure I have it, but is that I think there's evidence, and this is actually the purpose of one of our major studies this year going into the election cycle, is that this process we've been talking about here is undermining public confidence in the political process and in government and its ability to perform for justifiable reasons. People are observing gridlock, they're observing sort of this strongly worded language, they're observing a lack of will to actually talk across the aisles, and their confidence in the process and governance is undermined by that to some extent. And that is most extreme in these folks who aren't so ideological in their thinking, who look at a food fight and say, why should I listen? Why should I pay attention? Why should I participate? And that's where that sort of cycle kind of continues. So if you think about how to break that cycle, what are the ways in which people see government in a more positive light? And we've seen this happen in the past. Trust in government is one of the oldest polling questions, and it's declined over time, there's no question, but it also has come back at certain moments in American politics, sometimes rallying around foreign policy issues, sometimes when the economy is really soaring in the late 1990s, you saw confidence in the American government's ability to perform grow in a significant way during that period. So I think, again, how to achieve that there's no simple solution to it, but seeing government perform and understanding, thinking differently about government is probably part of that feedback loop that's driving those differences in participation, that's creating all of this dynamic in politics that we're talking about today.
Sir.
Thank you. 2 days ago in this very venue, Joseph Stiglitz said that we are now a nation of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. In essence, that democracy is an illusion, a conceit. Extrapolating from that, what we talk about and label politics is really not politics anymore, it's theater. And are we measuring the right things and labeling them correctly?
Well, I take your point. As a public opinion pollster, I firmly believe that the voice of the public matters, and I think that I don't disagree with the element of the argument that there are voices in the political process that have much more weight than others, and that some of that is due to changes in campaign finance laws. Some of it is the nature of just how politics works and communication and who shows up. I still believe that the public matters, and I think that at the end of the day, the balance of opinion of the public will override polls that take the nation too far off to one side or the other if that voice of that public can be heard. So I know polls aren't always the most popular thing in the world, especially at 6 o'clock at night when you're trying to sit down to dinner, but I also believe that without true broad-reaching representative surveys, the voice of the people is only what you hear from the political leaders saying, this is what the American people want. And you hear them say it all the time. This is what the American people are demanding X. The American people are demanding Y. Right. So I think, I think it's a matter of degree. I still think that, let me throw one piece of data out there, which is, when I was in graduate school in the late 1990s and early 2000s, well, I guess the late 80s and early 90s. I'm dating myself down here. There were two main themes in American politics, I was in political science. Declining public participation, voter turnout had been dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping, and the decline of American political parties. In fact, almost every political science textbook in that era was about the death of American parties and what a disaster that was for politics in America, because there was no real choice. And you even saw that in 2000. We were going into Gore v. Bush, and half the American public said, it doesn't really matter who wins. They're all the same. I mean, that's so different than where we are today, just 14 years later. And voter turnout has increased significantly over the last 20-year period. Now, you can paint sort of there's an oddly disturbing connection there, which is part of what may be mobilizing that turnout is the very polarization that we're talking about. And if you look at it in that lens, the fact that people see stark choices in front of them, see big differences between the political parties, and therefore are getting more engaged in the political process, well, isn't that good for democracy? But if what's mobilizing them are these very kind of strong, messages that don't allow for compromise, you're getting kind of an odd growth in political participation.
And how would you characterize the demographics of the increase in voter participation?
It's actually been very broad-based. You've seen some of the biggest surges in voter participation, at least at the presidential level, for minority groups. Some associate that with Obama particularly, but that's the question, one of the big questions of 2016, to be sure. But one of the biggest turns is a younger generation that's been remarkably active in politics, and that started even before Obama. The sort of high voter participation among this millennial generation actually started before Obama in 2004. The oldest millennials were a big factor in making that a closer election than people expected. So, there seems to be an era right now of actually historically relatively high voter engagement at those presidential cycle questions. But the differential between them and the midterms has grown as a result of that, and that's led to that kind of whipsaw effect that we were talking about.
Yeah, sir.
Building on the questions and on the answers, I was wondering about the comparative perspective, because you might see polarization when you look at it from an American perspective, but if you look at it from an European perspective or from a Latin American perspective, you might be surprised by the absence of polarization, considering the levels, for instance, of inequality and of racial inequality. So maybe two questions, but the first is, we do need differentiation to have options, to have democratic elections. If everybody is the same, as you told, doesn't make much sense to have no choices in elections. How polarized is really America if you compare it to other established democracies in Europe, in France, for instance? Mm-hmm. I studied in France, and in France there is a huge difference between the left and the right that I never have seen in the US. And of course, I do understand the point that there is extreme polarization that can lead to a collapse of the system, like in Venezuela, for instance, to name an example. But we're so far away from Venezuela, and even far away maybe from France. So what are the comparative numbers that you have?
It's an excellent question, and that's when we talk about our data in an international context, it is always one of the first things that comes to mind is you're talking about a binary polarization, but in most democracies that don't operate on the same election rules as America, you see a much wider spread of political parties representing a much wider, Now, whether the publics are more widely arrayed in those countries is very hard to kind of get to the bottom of. Is there but the evidence from the elections in those countries suggests that America is not necessarily more ideologically extreme, to use that term, than publics in other nations. I think it's another way of thinking about what we mean by the word polarization, which it's not about how far apart their actual views are. It's how crystallized they are into two big camps, you know, and that's really the American characteristic. And I mean, take any particular issue, for example. Fairly few Democrats and Republicans, while many Democrats and Republicans have a fairly consistent liberal and conservative view of the world, there's not that large a share of them that take very, very strong views on politics. In fact, the general view in both political parties isn't the most extreme position on an issue. I can give you an example. We ask people in general, do you think gun control laws ought to be stronger than they are today, or do you think gun rights should be the priority today? And you see a split in the nation these days. We've seen that for a while. The trend has actually been towards support for gun rights, and it's become increasingly polarized over time, with Democrats all saying we should have more gun control and Republicans very broadly saying we should have more focus on protecting gun rights. But if you probe those people and say, well, wait, do you think that guns should be outlawed entirely, or do you think there should just be tighter restrictions, but guns still allowed? The vast majority of Democrats are in that latter camp. There are very few Democrats who want to ban all guns. And the same on the right. There are very few Republicans who say they want no gun controls at all in America. They just want a focus on gun control and protecting rights, not a complete, elimination of every regulation out there. You can see that about healthcare. You can see that about the safety net. You can see that about any range of issues. Most Americans on the left and the right are to the left of center or to the right of center, but they're not really, really far out there. And so I think to your question, American polarization is not about a really distant, nationalism versus communism as it might be in France, parties that are very, 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 very distinct in their views. It's more about two parties that have become increasingly distinct, even if they're not necessarily on the face of it that much farther apart and arguably closer than in many other parts of the world. To have a choice. No. Different views. Oh, so he's asking, is it necessary to have differing views? I mean, I think this goes back to the way the U.S. Constitution is written. I think, I see no reason to think the U.S. will ever not be a two-party system. It's, we've set up electoral rules that really force consensus building to happen within the political parties, and then at the end of the day, we choose between one or the other. Most other representative democracies allow that coalition building to happen after the election, as multiple parties have to build coalitions to win the majorities at that stage. The only way I think we're ever going to see a broader representation of American viewpoints in the American political process is the kind of constitutional change that I doubt would happen.
Sir?
Hi. I was just wondering if you've given any thought to or looked at the data in the context of how congressional districts are created and how that might contribute to the echo chamber. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it goes back to the framing of this research, which is we see this sort of extreme differentiation in Congress. How much is that reflected in the public? And the answer is it's there in the public, but the signal's nowhere near as strong in the public as it is in Congress. So clearly there's something going on in the system that's taking a somewhat polarized public and turning it into a completely red versus blue elected, set of elected officials. And I think there are any number of causes to that. Some of it, as I've explained here, is who's turning out to vote. Some of it may be the way the electoral rules are set up. And I think, one of the interesting things, though, about gerrymandering is that it may not have the effect people think. That while gerrymandering is typically designed to protect incumbents, to create seats that are reasonably safe. Now, usually it's reasonably safe for a Republican incumbent or a Democratic incumbent, and it makes them more secure. I think what that means is their competition is happening then within the primaries, and then that's where there's an argument that that primary competition is controlled by people who are most active in the process and creates that sort of centrifugal force in the political process. But whether members who actually had to run in, say, 50-50 districts that had as many Democrats and Republicans in them would really face a different set of pressures is still one of the questions. The argument is, if they did, they would have to compete in that general election in a way that they would need to moderate their views in some ways and make the case to people who weren't so ideologically committed as to why they should be elected. That could be a good thing. Most of the people I've talked to who try to design elected congressional districts say that's a very hard goal to achieve, partly because of where we all do live and the fact that Democrats tend to live in similar areas and Republicans in other areas, and that to draw a district that's 50-50 is really difficult. There's a professor at Stanford who's done various redistricting models in California, and he said to create a district that's 50-50 Democrat-Republican in Northern California around the Bay Area, basically involves taking 2 blocks all the way across the center of San Francisco and Oakland, and then taking in, hundreds, huge swaths of the inner part of the state. And nobody would want that. Those people who lived on those 2 blocks in San Francisco would say, that's not my district. I want to be represented by a district of people like me. And the people who lived way out in the country would say, I don't want those city people in my district. I want to be in a district that represents me. So there's actually an interesting pull about how people perceive representation. And I'm not sure most people really want districts that are that oddly shaped and combining communities that don't necessarily have affinity for each other. So it's another interesting kind of push-pull in the process. But I do think that gerrymandering has contributed to some of what we're seeing.
And in that regard, before we take a question or comment from Pat, what, in your view, would it take to mobilize all of those folks in the middle to become more active participants in building a sense of community other than fear?
Right.
In Boston, for example, 40 years ago, communities were deeply polarized around race and education, but also the delivery of social services. Violence resulted. But it ultimately ended because a number of people who hadn't been engaged, who were part of that more silent middle, realized that the polarization was having many different negative effects on the communities, and they began to come together to mitigate that and to then set policies and to carry those out in a way that didn't end the polarization, but ended the dominance of the polarization. And most of those folks were not in a position where they needed to be afraid of outcomes. Right. So the question is, what does it take other than fear to motivate folks in the middle to come together around building community and developing shared policies?
Right. Well, I think we often look at 3 broader environmental factors that probably play into it. One of them is just how bad have things gotten, and at a certain point do people really get so angry at the inefficacy of the political process that they're mobilized to solve it, and that's a little bit of what you're describing. And who knows, maybe the public has reached that state, where they're so angry that they really want to change the way politics is happening. George W. Bush in 2000 was going to be a uniter, not a divider. Barack Obama was going to change politics in fundamental ways. Neither succeeded, whether by will or by an inability to overcome it. Different people will have different views. I think another factor is just the level of stress in the public. That this kind of cycle that we're talking about is more rooted when people feel insecure and stable. I mean, that fear argument has a much easier trigger when people feel nervous to start with. And that can be a foreign policy situation like we had in the earlier part of the 2000s. It could be the post crash period that we've been in for the past decade, where people feel fundamentally insecure in many ways about where the nation is headed and where their own insecure about their own personal situation. That allows for that kind of much more impassioned voice in politics. And as I said, in the late 1990s, as people were feeling better, you saw some of that relax in some pretty significant ways. People, this is not the science side of political science, but people also look to the leader who can actually articulate that message in a way and try to make the case for why it's not just using the word change or using the word uniter, but figuring out the message that actually makes that an actionable position after the election is over. Taking it out of just a campaign phrase and turning it into an actual sort of approach to political decision making. We haven't seen success in that over the last cycle, but maybe we will. Pat?
You just talked about some forces, abstract forces that might make a difference in the polarization. But I want to ask you now for something more specific. What can individual people do to help counteract this polarization?
Well, it's hard. At the end of the day, we are one individual in a big, broad society, and most of the dynamics we're talking about here are very broad and hard for individuals to really tilt at. I guess I would say a couple of things. One of them is probably resisting that sense of seeing the other side as the enemy. I think it's a natural tendency. Some evolutionary biologists would say it's hardwired in the human psyche, to kind of form these kind of tribal sort of approaches to thinking, whether it's sports teams or whether it's politics, and to see it in that sense of us versus them. And that's an easy habit to fall into in politics. And then that notion of sorting, where people are consistently, seeing a whole range of issues consistently through a liberal or a conservative viewpoint, are people really evaluating each of those issues individually and understanding that, yes, maybe it's okay to draw the line and be unwilling to give on principle when it comes to healthcare, but we need to have a more reasoned conversation about gun control or about homosexuality or about something else. And maybe it's different in different spaces rather than seeing everything through that lens of we can't give ground, there's a principle here we have to stand up for. I'm not saying people shouldn't stand up for principle. I mean, the other way of looking at that kind of what we've been talking about today is people want to stand up for what's right. And there are people on both sides who think they know what's right and they want to stand up for it. But that trend, that tendency is part of what feeds a lot of this. And so I think at that individual level, communicating, hearing, listening, trying not to fall into that habit of seeing the other side as the enemy and giving an inch means you're somehow giving up a principle. That's probably what exacerbates a lot of this.
And I would just add to that it's not clear that everyone cares about polarization, but as among those of us who do, one of the things that we clearly need to do is to challenge ourselves to place ourselves in circumstances where we think we're going to be uncomfortable because we're going to be surrounded by people and or ideas that are anathema to us. I use my own case. I've lived in New England most of my life, but a number of years ago I bought what I thought would be a kind of future retirement place in a rural part of South Carolina. And early on, there was a hurricane that was going to come through, and I was in the house alone, and there was a family that lived across the street, a large fundamentalist family. And one of the first things they did was to send two of their kids across the street to knock on my door to let me know that a storm was coming through, that they knew I hadn't experienced one, that the power was likely to go out, and that I was likely to feel alone and threatened in that circumstance, and that they, as a white fundamentalist family talking to an African American from New England, that they were there for me, and that if anything happened, I should feel free and comfortable to walk across the road and to be with them in a sense of safety. After they did that, I thought to myself, I wonder if this would have happened in New York, where I grew up, or in Connecticut, where I went to school, or here in Massachusetts, where I've lived for many years, that in fact, there are areas of common ground and sharing and caring that we don't always appreciate in others, and we won't unless we make the effort to reach out to find out what kinds of people they are. Yes?
Well, actually, my question and concern was related to that, the lack of personal interaction. And it was about 5 years ago that I heard Tom Daschle speak at a forum at the JFK Library, addressing his concerns about the dramatic change in Congress, and he attributed it to cameras in the chambers, so that they weren't talking to each other anymore. They were talking to an audience and preparing sound bites. The lack of time they spend in Washington, and just a percentage of time there, and if any of us, I guess, had that percentage of time in the workplace, we'd be fired. But they don't cross the aisle. They don't forge any relationships anymore, like the way Ted Kennedy did, and other examples. So if they're not setting the example, if our leaders aren't setting that example, to the extent that they're changing not just the climate, perhaps the way the body functions. I know I was disturbed to hear minority leadership say that their primary goal was to make the current sitting president a one-term president. Right. I mean, I would imagine many have thought that, but what it took to actually voice that publicly on the media, and the concern that the media, the role the media plays in facilitating this perceived polarization, because they clearly have a stake in that. They are a business. It may be free press, but they are a business, and we have to remember that. So my concern is is this polarization perhaps permanently changing Washington in ways that might not be reversible?
Well, I think it's an excellent example. In fact, when we were researching to design this study, we sat down and had a series of lunches with about 20 different people from academia and political world and campaign world and otherwise. And one of our questions was, is polarization a top-down effect? Is this something that's happening in Washington and then the signals are coming out and sort of infecting the public, some would say? Or is this really something that is happening in the American society in various ways and that the elected officials are just responding to it? And invariably, the folks outside of the campaign environment and the Hill environment said, oh, it's top down, sort of, pointing out what you're saying, that there are sort of fundamental changes, whether it's cameras in Congress or money in politics or, the ability to travel home, which, even as recently as 20, 30 years ago was a lot harder if you lived in Alaska or California or even Missouri. That all these things are creating an environment that is changing the way people hear about politics, the tone of politics, and that's sort of trickling down into the public. But invariably, when we talk to the people who worked on Capitol Hill and in campaigns, they always said it's bottom up. We're just responding to the people. We're just responding to the electorates that we hear from. It's so vivid to them that their action, whether it's to say that their goal is to make sure Obama's a one-term president, or whether it's to say, we're going to keep the government shut down until, Obamacare is ended, or immigration policy is, undone, or whatever, the issue might be, is a conviction that they're following their electorates in a way. And that sort of disjuncture is very hard to overcome. It's hard to kind of get to the bottom of. I think it is all entwined in the same things that we're talking about who turns out, about the fact that when people in politics are defining that voice of the people they're reacting to, it clearly is, based on our data, a very narrow range of the actual American public. But it's the one that they feel is the one they need to listen to, and whether that's because of the nature of elections, gerrymandering, primary elections, or whether it's because of the sort of feedback loops of information that they're hearing from people. The only people they're hearing from are their true believers, and therefore they think that's really what the whole Vox Populi is. But that seems to be their conviction. You know, they feel like they're just reacting to the people.
I would just add that this is, in fact, we're privileged to live in a country that is full of extraordinarily diverse and interesting people. But we can too often stereotype who those people are, and in the course of stereotyping people, we find ourselves being much more polarized than we need to be. Mm-hmm. So as much as we hold certain political views, we're also parents and educators and spiritual people. We cook and we fly fish and we race motorcycles and we go to museums and we listen to hip hop and we do a range of other things. And very often, by stereotyping people, we close ourselves off to understanding what in fact are common elements in the way we approach the world and think about things. And the polarization obviously works to offset that sense that in fact it's okay to reach out and to really talk to someone who's not quite like ourselves. And that accounts in part for the enclaves, and it accounts in part for the perpetuation of social isolation that is utterly unnecessary. One of the most interesting components of social media at this point is that very often people will connect with each other through social media who they might not have if they had met them initially in a more old-fashioned traditional environment, and they discover that they have a lot more in common than they would have if they had simply stood next to each other at an MBTA station. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to think about the different ways in which we can reach across to people, and not all of them will immediately be face-to-face. Some may be through social media or other means. But the point is that polarization tends, it seems to me, to be offset when you get to know that other person as a real person. And not just as a cipher or an avatar or a metaphor for something else. We've had, I think, a terrific conversation. I want to emphasize to everyone that the studies that Pew Research does, and how many do you do a year?
I think we did 158 last year, but
right.
They're not all this thick.
Right. So the studies are available online. They are presented wonderfully, it seems to me, both in terms of text and graphics. Many of the charts that you have presented are extremely useful and important, and I would encourage everyone to take a look at your website and to download much of the research that you've done, because it's quite fascinating. And it's one thing to hear you on NPR, as we enjoy doing. It enriches that experience, it seems to me, when folks go directly to the studies and see the depth of analysis that you have been able to present on what's going on within the United States, within the Americas, and elsewhere. So on behalf of the Cambridge Forum, I want to thank you for being with us tonight and presenting us with some challenging thoughts about ending polarization, using polarization, moving forward from it. And I would ask our audience to extend their thanks to you as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
We needed help and we needed witnesses, because this was it was just so crazy. Like, and we can't. It was just so crazy you couldn't make it up. And I was so glad to see that so many people came.